Hey, who's ready for Bertolt Brecht? Woo! The cat is not. She's really bored. Okay. Our lives are about to get much better. Let's talk about Brecht. We'll talk about context, some theories, approaches, the Threepenny Opera, which is an adaptation of the Beggar's Opera. Look at how things circle around. And we'll have time for some discussion. Well, we'll have it online. Heyo. All right. The Brecht cartoon from Crash Course is one of the better ones out there. So definitely make sure you have a little fun watching that. It's really helpful too. So yeah, that's a good one. It's always nice when other people collaborate to help you plan your work. And, let's be real, I'm not going to animate things as well as a bunch of people whose job it is to do that for PBS. So here's some context for Herr Brecht. After World War I, we've got a lot of political upheaval, and this is sort of when Brecht comes of age. He also wrote during and after World War II, because they're 25 years apart. There was great economic, especially, but also social and racial and all kinds of things. Inequality all over Germany after World War I. They lose. They're hit with reparations from the U.S. At the same time, there's a flourishing creative culture. It was called the Weimar Republic. The government in Germany in the 1920s before Hitler comes to power. If you're interested in this time period, there's a really fun show on Netflix. Well, not just fun, it's just smart and beautifully filmed. It's a show called Babylon Berlin. You can watch it dubbed or you can watch it with subtitles. It's kind of a noir show, but definitely watch it if you kind of find that period interesting. We'll come back to that time period as well when we talk about Bob Fosse and Cabaret. Hitler is coming. I mean, it's, on the one hand, there is massive increase in toleration of sexual differences, gender diversity, sexual diversity. At the same time, there are also communist people are scared of in Germany at that time. They kind of thought that that the Nazis would help get rid of the communists and then everything would be sort of calmed down and that the two groups would kind of fight each other off. But that's not what happened. There was a lot of skepticism about sort of money-driven bourgeoisie, as there often is. And also, what happens to people when money kind of takes over the essence of who they are. If you've gone through a depression and you've gone through a time period where your currency is really unstable, this is something that people were going through in Germany in the 20s. This is, again, right before our stock market crashes. They were finally kind of getting their money situation back together in the 20s. Money talks and is able to kind of, turn people's lives around. But, do you then become about looking for money in all aspects? Are you always kind of on the make or on the take? Whatever, on the something, on the prowl. Let's talk about themes and theories. So the jest or justice, and this is acting or performance as a gesture or as an approximation of a character. It's not in the sense of like making gestures by losing your hands, but the idea that you're not creating an entire reality. Your performance gestures to the interiority of the character you play. It is approximate. It is never going to be exact. And that's okay, according to Brecht. There's also the V effect and alienation specifically. And this is one of the things that we're going to return to a few times. That theater is not about drawing you in. It is about distancing the audience, estranging the audience, making you feel differently. It's not a warm, fuzzy feeling or a happy ending. It's about, whoa, what the heck did I just see? And you talk about it with your, clever intellectual circle of friends afterwards. And you think about what it might mean. And the fact that it's supposed to make you uncomfortable. There's a recognition that someone who can afford a theater ticket is also someone who might have the money to make change in the world. And that if you go in there and you confront that person and show them something different, that theater can have that kind of social effect. Another influence on Brecht is early film, specifically the application of montage techniques to playwriting. And montage in film is when you have different shots edited together to kind of show a bunch of related events that aren't necessarily consequential. And in Brecht, it's the same kind of thing, where you have short, separate scenes. They don't have obvious main arcs where, like, somebody walks in and says, "Hi, I'm home," and somebody responds and says, "I have a conflict," and then somebody else sings. It might be someone answers the phone, and then, someone else is walking to the bank. I mean, the kinds of images we get used to seeing in films. So if there is a cinematic quality to a play that you are watching, think about whether there's other Brechtian stuff happening to it. This, in terms of, if you've ever done any work with Marxist theory, you see some intersections with Brecht here. The idea that we must reveal the conditions that produce the reality that we have. And in his case, it's, laying bare the causal network that kind of runs throughout our culture. This is one really important kind of analytical tool here. Is the dominant viewpoint the viewpoint of the dominators? And if it is, can you rework it so that it isn't? And when we get to Cabaret, we'll talk about this too, because that's very Brechtian. And it takes place when Brecht was doing stuff. Writing from the standpoint of the class that has prepared the broadest solutions for the most pressing problems afflicting human society. Yeah, which classes have had to solve all the problems? Not always the wealthiest classes, right? It's the people who are kind of on the margins who always have to keep adapting and working and making their own choices and figuring things out. Like, they're the people who are affected first. How dynamic development can be, things can change rapidly. I like concrete so as to encourage abstraction. You can show something that might seem very simple, but perhaps that makes us think more. We see this later in playwrights like Beckett, where you have in Krapp's Last Tape, he eats a whole bunch of bananas while he's on stage. That might seem sort of silly, but like, it's one of the more concrete things you can imagine. And then you think to yourself, well, why? Why is he eating these bananas? And then all of a sudden, your brain starts to come up with creative ideas about it. You don't want to over-identify with the characters. So that alienation, the V effect, it helps to confront the audience. Again, acting can approximate a character. You don't want to over-identify with the characters you play either. And again, one of the major questions that someone like Brecht encourages you to think about, well, again, especially, what is the viewpoint of the dominators? Is it worse for a man to rob a bank, or is it worse for a man to own the bank? Well, the viewpoint we tend to see comes from the one who owns the bank, that he is the victim. And that might be your perspective too. But then when you think about someone, controlling a bunch of resources and not helping the poor, then it can feel like a different moral quandary, and maybe with a different solution. Not crime. Crime doesn't pay. However, in the Threepenny Opera, it pays. Heyo. All right. So Brecht and Kurt Weill, who was a really famous composer, used Gaze, The Beggar's Opera, as a vehicle to discuss capitalist corruption. By the way, this is not a chapter in Showtime. This is just a separate Brecht lecture, so you learn more. If you think about the 18th century as a kind of, seed for capitalism, you've got Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, from that same century. The content of The Beggar's Opera is all about everybody's a commodity, everybody's trying to steal from everybody, and, the smart ones end up making a buck off the other ones before they've even known it. It goes back to kind of some of those capitalist roots to trace how we got to modern corruption, or at least what Brecht would have thought of as modern corruption. It's very much a show for the people. We talked about the ballads as the structure of that. Someone like Brecht would have been very responsive to that working class origin. It's set in 19th century, so it's set later than The Beggar's Opera, but it's still relatively, descended from it. Instead of Mac Heath, the sort of roguish villain of the original one, he's been called Mac the Knife now. You will maybe remember that song on our playlist. In German, it's Mackie Messer. So if you ever hear a song called Mackie Messer, Mac for Mackie, and Messer is knife. I don't know much German, but I know how to say knife. That's probably disturbing. He's married to Polly. He's pursued by Lucy and by the law. Ballads are interwoven with the story. They don't keep much of the original except for that kind of the framework, the subject, the tone. It's a gesture in many ways to the original without being a literal, transposition of the original. So we're not at mid-century yet, but I wanted to talk about it, early 20th century a little bit, but, think about when works of art are very general and when they are very specific and why you think that might be. How might we keep Brecht's theories in mind over the course of this class, and think about what a Brechtian adaptation of a familiar work for you might be like. I mean, Brecht does, The Sound of Music might be pretty random. When is the gesture or approximation valuable in acting? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, when is it good to alienate an audience? Thanks a lot, everybody. Happy Brechting.